All right, and with that, the president signs this. He says that the air traffic control system will be turned over to a self-financing nonprofit organization, will not need tax dollars. He says that dozens of countries have modernized in this way. His example that he gave today was Canada. He said they did so years ago, and according to him, handled 50% more air traffic than we do now. He said that the problem is that we are stuck in the past. President Trump said, annually, we handle about 1 billion passengers, and it's based on a system, a model, if you will, when we used to take about 100,000 through the air each year. So, modernizing air traffic control made official today by President Trump. Will continue to cover whatever other developments come out of that signing that we're watching live right now. Sandra?
Fox News alert, more arrests in the London terror attack, police raiding homes and taking a number of people into custody as ISIS claims responsibility for the horrific attack that left 7 dead and 21 people critically hurt. This as British police face questions about whether any of the attackers had been known to authorities. This is Outnumbered. I'm Sandra Smith. Here today, Harris Faulkner, Meghan McCain, host of Kennedy on Fox Business, Kennedy, and today's hashtag One Lucky Guy, the former ambassador to the United Nations and currently senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Ambassador John Bolton is there. He is outnumbered. Welcome back to you, Ambassador. Wonderful to have you today.
Glad to be back.
Another busy week. Let's get right to it. British police carrying out more raids. 11 people remain in custody as they investigate Saturday's attack on the London Bridge in a nearby market. They say they have identified the 3 attackers killed by armed cops who rammed a speeding van into pedestrians before jumping out, slashing others with long knives. All this as reporters say at least one of the attackers may have already been on the police's radar. David Lee Miller joins us live from London with the latest. David?
Sandra, despite the fact the authorities say they have now identified these 3 attackers, they have not yet released their names publicly. But according to a published report here in London, at least one of the attackers made no secret of his extremist views. According to the Times of London, one of the attackers was Pakistani-born, and he was reported to police for trying to recruit children to join ISIS. The paper says police were also warned that this same person also accessed extremist material online. And according to another separate report, one of the attackers was featured in a British documentary on British jihadis. And although ISIS has now claimed responsibility for the attack, police here say there's nothing to suggest the terror group did anything more than inspire the carnage. The search for accomplices continues. Following a series of raids over the weekend, there were multiple raids this morning, and at this hour, 11 people have been detained under the British anti-terrorism laws. The Prime Minister says more needs to be done to combat terrorism.
We need to review our counter-terrorism strategy to make sure the police and security services have all the powers they need. If that means increasing the length of custodial sentences for terrorism-related offences, even apparently less serious offences, that is what we will do.
The first victim of the attack has now been identified, a Canadian woman, 30 years old, her name Christine Archibald. She worked at a homeless shelter. She came overseas to join her boyfriend. She was killed when she was struck by a van that the terrorists tried to use as a weapon of mass destruction. And lastly, you can take a look at the live scene here this afternoon. You can see that the area surrounding London Bridge still remains sealed off by a security perimeter. There are police here on the ground still searching the area where the attacks occurred. There's heightened security, in fact, throughout the entire city with an emphasis on bridges here. This attack taking place on and near London Bridge, and you might recall, Sandra, there was an attack in March taking place on a bridge not far from this country's parliament. And in just about an hour's time, we expect that a vigil is going to be held here as the city and the country mourn the 7 people killed and the dozens who were injured. Back to you.
All right, David Lee Miller, live for us on the ground in London. Thank you, David Lee. If I could, Ambassador, ask you about what we continue to hear reported now, and as David Lee Miller brought up, that at least one of the suspects was on the radar of authorities, was known to authorities. What does that tell you?
Well, it says that the authorities are reluctant to engage even in what I think is permissible investigative behavior to try and prevent these attacks before they happen. It's the normal law enforcement approach is to try and apprehend the criminals after it happens. That's unacceptable in the case of terrorism. I want to focus on one thing the police said about ISIS. They said there's no evidence of any connection other than that maybe the terrorists were inspired by ISIS. Don't these guys get the point? This is not IBM in the 1950s with people wearing white shirts and dark ties and dark suits, sitting at desks looking at boxes and lines on an organizational chart. It is precisely the point that ISIS can inspire people over the internet or through social media and get them to engage in terrorist attacks without going through a formal organization chart. That doesn't make things better because they can't find more of a connection. It makes it worse.
But it seems like, Kennedy, this story seems to repeat itself. We find out in the wake of a terrorist attack that the suspect or suspects were known to authorities. They were alerted to authorities. They were under investigation at some point, but still they slipped through the cracks.
Yeah, it's really frustrating, and it's something we've seen obviously in this country with San Bernardino and Orlando, and also something they've seen in the UK. And both countries are guilty of mass spying. And I would say that because there are so many people that are targeted, you take the worst ones who definitely deserve the kind of scrutiny and perhaps imprisonment that the ambassador was talking about. And these are, I mean, imagine if there were a group of serial killers unfurling flags, identifying themselves in parks.
They're called ISIS.
Exactly right. And that's what this 27-year-old terrorist did. He was part of a documentary in the UK and also unrolled an ISIS flag at a demonstration. And this is someone who was known to law enforcement and intelligence in the UK.
So I want to...
What more do you want?
No.
They're getting everything they want right now, but we are taking it to them in some parts of the world. We're trying to get to Raqqa. We need to do more than that. I've had generals telling me just this weekend. But I want to get back to your point about inspired versus orchestrated, or command and control is normally how we term it. This is so different than anything we've ever seen, because you don't see people doing things in the name of al-Qaeda. I mean, their recruitment has been very juicy, if you will, out there in recruitment land. What is different about ISIS, and what are we not getting that we better get quick?
Well, I think all of this terrorist activity fundamentally stems from an ideology that's opposed to the West, that wants to set up a different kind of control mechanism for the world, and we're not responding to that in an adequate way. We treat it as though somehow it's not an ideology, that the terrorists by spontaneous combustion are normal people one day and terrorists the next. That's not how it goes. And since we're not responding to the ideology, since we say, well, Islam is a religion of peace and we don't want to interfere with it, well, here's a news flash. Christianity is a religion of peace too. Christians have killed each other for religious basis for 2,000 years and counting. It happens in Islam. This is a radical form of the religion. It's a civil war within Islam. And unless we start acting like we understand that, we will always be behind this story.
All right. Meantime, President Trump saying the terror attack in the UK is more proof that we need his travel ban back home, adding that political correctness is making us less safe. The president tweeting after the attack Saturday, quote, "We need to be smart, vigilant, and tough. We need the courts to give us back our rights. We need the travel ban as an extra level of safety." And this morning, tweeting, quote, "The Justice Department should ask for an expedited hearing of the watered-down travel ban before the Supreme Court and seek much tougher version." White House counselor Kellyanne Conway says President Trump is echoing the concerns of many here and abroad. Watch.
The president's frustrations really reflect the frustrations and the fears of many Americans and Brits and freedom-loving people all over the world who don't want this to be the new normal. This president got elected in large part because he was the tougher person on national security and defeating radical Islamic terrorism. He, of course, is willing to actually say the words. You name it and then you defeat it.
But former Secretary of State John Kerry says a travel ban would actually help terrorists bring in new members. Watch.
Travel ban will be cannon fodder to the recruiters. It's the worst thing we could do. But we do need to do, and we do, extraordinary screening, but a great deal more effort has to go into the building of community.
Meghan McCain?
I mean, John Kerry can really take a seat for a second. He's part of the same administration that said that climate change was a greater existential threat than ISIS. They also gave the Iran deal billions of dollars to fund terrorism. I would listen to absolutely nothing he has to say. It's completely normal to take a pause on our immigration policies right now to reconsider what's happening with terrorism. I want to talk about the politics really quick. The London mayor, Sadiq Khan, said, quote, "There is no reason to be alarmed by this. You're in the safest global city in the world." I don't know about you, Harris, but I'm glad I have a president that is actually using the normal rhetoric, that after 2 terrorist attacks coming off of Manchester and now onto this, isn't saying everything's fine, nothing, there's no problem, you're in the safest city in the world. It's all right for everyone to be scared right now. It seems to be happening more and more. There seems to be an amping up. It doesn't feel like anything is working. When you're talking about the tech community in particular, I don't know exactly what the answer is, but I know when the guy who committed the attack in Manchester has a record on Twitter and this guy has a record of being on TV and online with it, something isn't working.
Well, when you talk about the politics of this, and Ambassador, I'll go to you on this. David Bossie, a former deputy Trump campaign manager, said the next attack the Democrats will be responsible for unless something changes. Watch.
That's a very basic safety measure that the president wants. It's just one measure of many, but it's one that he needs, and he needs to have it back, and it needs to be stopped being politicized by these Democrats who are really responsible for these future attacks if these people get in here based on us not being able to secure our borders.
Yeah. Ambassador?
Well, I think it's a risk for the Democrats. I think John Kerry, in the clip we just showed, indicates he still doesn't understand what the problem is. I mean, he could have talked about Gitmo being a recruitment tool, or this or that or the other thing. It's not the specific PR issue that the radicals focus on. It's generating a hatred for Western society and a devotion to their radical form of Islam. The particular circumstance is just the match. It's not the fuel underneath of it. And that's why in this continuing threat, the people who are trying to put up an anti-terrorism protective barrier for this country are faced by people here who are anti-terrorism. They're more worried about what the people trying to protect us are doing than they are about the people who are killing us.
All right, well said. We'll leave it there. The Homeland Security Secretary says if people knew what he knows, they might never leave the house. This says the U.S. intel community has equally scary info on the terror threat level in Europe. Plus, the UK suffering its 3rd terror attack this year, renewed debate about whether the world is too tolerant of Islamic extremism.
Fox News alert now on the intelligence leading up to the London terror attacks. A U.S. official says classified information shows the level of threats against Europe now at its worst in a decade. This is Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly warns a similar attack could happen here in the United States. Chief Intel Correspondent Catherine Herridge is live for us in Washington. Hey, Catherine.
Well, thank you, Harris. ISIS is claiming responsibility, but it's still not clear whether the claim is opportunistic or the terror group played a role training or directing the operation. British security sources reporting that the very early indications suggest the attacks may have been pulled together at short notice, with U.S. and U.K. intelligence remaining focused on the suspects whose names are being withheld for security reasons and whether the suspects acted alone or had a support network. The London Telegraph is reporting that British security had an alleged ISIS cell under surveillance in East London just a few weeks ago. This is where we're seeing all of these raids and arrests, with the cell discussing how to launch a truck and knife assault. Counterterrorism analysts this morning are drawing our attention to these photos of the suspects with canisters strapped to their bodies that look like suicide vests, saying this tactic is designed to intimidate victims and to also guarantee martyrdom, because security forces are trained to kill, not negotiate with suicide bombers. As the British Prime Minister calls for a new approach this morning on Fox, a Republican member of the House Homeland Security and Intelligence Committees said the FBI and police in this country should use the same approach that tackled mob crime.
You have to have infiltration. You have to have constant surveillance because, again, you can have all the security in the world, but if that security shows up after the fact, the lives have already been lost.
And just as more evidence that the threat in Europe and as well as the UK is extremely intense, the British Prime Minister has confirmed that police in that country have thwarted 5 credible plots since the March attack on Westminster Bridge that's just about a mile from Saturday night's attack, Harris.
Catherine, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Ambassador, as you hear that, does that give any more support to what the president is putting into motion or trying to, and is the message getting through that we need this kind of change?
Well, I don't think the message is getting through. I think we need to do more. Look, this case of Great Britain really is a case of an intelligence failure and a failure of the protective system generally. After Manchester, they raised the threat level to severe, the highest level, and then brought it back down again, just in time for the attack in London. So if you're a citizen saying, is my government aware of what's going on enough to be able to tell me how worried I ought to be, the answer there, sadly, is no. And as long as people are hesitant to deal with the threat because of self-imposed constraints about appearing negative about a particular religion, we're going to face this. You have to be honest. The threat is not coming from Presbyterians. And therefore, police methods that are legitimate to investigate and hopefully prevent a crime need to be applied to the kind of threat we're seeing. It is an ideological threat that's being spread. You do not have freedom of religion to conspire to commit murder, period.
So would it seem reasonable then, Kennedy, that we take a 90-day pause? I mean, is what the president trying to do right now well within the bounds, and what needs to be said about it? It's kind of like a corporation putting a new employee on a 90-day probationary period.
Yes, but there are those who would argue on both sides of the aisle that we've had that probationary period since the first executive order was submitted. And, you know, how much more time does it take, and when does that 90 days start? Why aren't some of our immigration agencies doing the exact same thing right now?
I think Ambassador wants to jump in.
Yeah, but I actually agree on one point with John Kerry, who appears to have lost his mind with some of the illustrations he's putting out there, that, you know, we need to know what that extreme vetting is. We need to know what those procedures are, and how are they being implemented, what are they exactly, and how are they going to keep us safer?
Ambassador?
Well, I think in that sense, the president has understated the task ahead. You need much more than a few tweaks around the edges to get to extreme vetting. I speak as an alumnus of the State Department that watched the Consular Affairs Bureau try and handle the visa entry issue for decades historically. I think you need the whole system revamped. It was not addressed.
Well, that'll take longer than 90 days.
To keep out the terrorist threat that we face today. And it's antiquated, it's bogged down. Really, it needs something.
Why not privatize that as well, along with air traffic control?
It's hard to see how we could do worse than we're doing now, honestly. Despite the fact that people are good-hearted who are doing it, they're up against an impossible system to protect us.
So, Sandra, we've been reporting 23,000 suspected terrorists in the UK alone.
Yeah, and when you look at the threat level here at home and you hear that this could happen here next, you are concerned that this becomes the new normal, that we're just getting used to this, and that our level of fear actually is dropping.
Yeah, and I think that goes to the question of what allows people to be radicalized, whether they're coming from overseas or whether they're born and raised in the United States. The evidence is that the radicalization comes as people get more modern and get more benefits. It's not the secular effect that you might expect. It's an inducement, actually, to designate their separateness from modern society by becoming more fanatic.
No, that's absolutely right. And it's strange because this is one of the areas where capitalism doesn't have the same effect, the same freeing effect that it does in other parts of the world where people are oppressed for different non-theocratic reasons.
And I can read your mind, Megan, and we'll come back.
Oh, I'm good.
Okay. The British leader also calling for a crackdown in cyberspace. I don't know if you knew this. The British Prime Minister said this yesterday. Something then candidate Donald Trump also called for in 2015. Would regulating the internet prevent more attacks in the future?
We cannot allow this ideology the safe space it needs to breed. Yet that is precisely what the internet and the big companies that provide internet-based services provide. We need to work with allied democratic governments to reach international agreements that regulate cyberspace to prevent the spread of extremist and terrorism planning.
That was British Prime Minister Theresa May calling for regulation of the internet following the latest atrocity in London, a point that then candidate Donald Trump made on the campaign trail in 2015.
We have to talk to them, maybe in certain areas, closing that internet up in some way. Somebody will say, oh, freedom of speech, freedom of speech. These are foolish people. We have a lot of foolish people. We have a lot of foolish people.
Tech giants saying they're already fighting terror content. Twitter issuing a statement, quote, "We continue to expand the use of technology as part of a systemic approach to removing this type of content." And Google adding, "We are committed to working in partnership with the government and NGOs to tackle these challenging and complex problems and share the government's commitment to ensuring terrorists do not have a voice online." Ambassador Bolton, if we can get child porn off the internet, if Twitter and Instagram know which shoes I was looking at on Zappos and could put that exact ad on my Facebook and Instagram, why can't we flag terrorists better?
Well, I don't think we should regulate the internet in order to combat terrorism, but I think we need to be clear that law enforcement and intelligence have to be able to observe better what's going on. And that isn't interfering in anybody's privacy. Scott McNeely, the former CEO of Sun Microsystems, famously said in the late 1990s, there is no privacy on the internet. Get used to it.
So what's the problem? Why can't we do that?
Well, I think that there are cultural factors that inhibit the government from doing this in ways because people say, well, you're going to interfere with freedom of religion and freedom of expression, things like that. I just simply don't think it's true. I think if you look at ISIS's success in communicating through social media, they are way ahead of us, and they're getting a header.
And the companies themselves are sort of, they say they're trying to sort of self-regulate. Facebook came out in the wake of this attack, right, Kennedy, and said, we are going to make this a hostile environment for terrorists. Mark Zuckerberg hired another 3,000 people to work at his company to try to work on this. But they don't have the answer. So for Theresa May to say, we need to regulate the internet, regulate these companies in order to fight terrorism, she better have an answer to how to do that.
She doesn't have an answer. I mean, she doesn't have an answer, and I think that's a big deflection from the intelligence failures in that country, and that's why she's having a hard time, because she's late to the game in her solutions for terrorism. But over-regulating the internet, turning it into some sort of bureaucratic central planning agency, I mean, that sounds like a really bad idea.
Well, let me push back on that. Over-regulating the internet, it's sort of the Wild West.
Okay,
I mean,
it's not necessarily the Wild West, and when you have government wanting to centralize the medium, you're losing the point of this whole thing, and that's the message. ISIS is so effective not because they're on Snapchat, but because of what they're saying and who they're saying it to. They're able to capitalize on people who are disaffected in society for whatever reason, and there's not been a good alternative. Whether it's analysis or
I never understand this, and I say this with respect. If you can take child porn off the internet because it's illegal, if you're trying to recruit terrorists, saying keywords that have to do with ISIS, can't you flag these individuals? And I'm sorry, but we are dealing with the person who blew up a bunch of little girls at an Ariana Grande concert, having tweets out there that could have been flagged.
That's why
whatever you want to say about regulating the internet, it's not just about regulating the internet. It's about keeping citizens safe. And I'm not talking about censorship, not having freedom of religion. And the problem is we take this debate to a level that is just not logical. We are dealing with different people who don't abide by the same set of rules and morals and standards that we do.
So that's why it was a little odd.
The deep web.
But it was a little odd to hear Theresa May.
See it at all.
So we shouldn't even try.
To hear Theresa May this weekend say, enough is enough. And then it was almost like she turned and said, I'm calling Google. She didn't just say that we need to rein in with regulation, which would make you scratch your brain enough for the reasons that Sandra and Kennedy have talked about. But she said that the internet companies like Google are complicit in what has happened over the weekend. That is too far.
Well, I don't think they're complicit, but I also don't think...
That's what she said.
I don't think throwing 3,000 children at the problem is going to solve it either. The reason she's saying this is that she's in trouble politically, and I hate to be crass.
It's a response. It's a reaction.
She was Home Secretary for 6 years. She ought to be deeply into this question of detecting and preventing
But last
terrorism.
question, should those companies, Facebook, Twitter, Google, should they be working more closely with government agencies?
With law enforcement, absolutely.
They do work very closely with law enforcement.
Not enough.
Not very closely.
They do absolutely fulfill vast majority of the
Well, they're doing a great job.
All the time
great job, Twitter. I mean, that guy the Manchester shooter had a whole track on Twitter, and not only was it not caught, but he got away with killing a bunch of little girls at an Ariana Grande concert. Sorry if I don't think Silicon Valley's doing their part right now.
Well, neither
Fired FBI Director James Comey preparing to break his silence, testifying before a Senate panel in just 3 days. What can we expect as lawmakers zero in on the Russia probe? And could the White House invoke executive privilege to block Comey's testimony?
Are you a veteran? Own a home?
Woo! It's a spirited Monday, and we'll make more Outnumbered in just a moment. For now, let's go to Melissa Francis with what's coming up in the second hour of Happening Now. Hello.
It is spirited. I'm loving your show today. Coming up here in the next hour, as President Trump doubles down on his push for a travel ban, many are calling for Supreme Court Justice Ruth Ginsburg to recuse herself from this case. We're going to talk about why. Plus, several Arab nations are cutting ties with Qatar, accusing the oil-rich country of supporting terrorism. The latest on this diplomatic crisis. And 5 people killed in an early morning workplace shooting. What led to that deadly rampage? All that at the top of the hour. Back to you guys.
We'll be watching. Thank you.
Former FBI Director James Comey is set to testify before the Senate Intelligence Committee on Thursday. His first public testimony since President Trump fired him nearly a month ago. Virginia Senator Mark Warner, the committee's ranking Democrat, says one of his main goals will be to have Comey clarify his conversations with President Trump, particularly when it comes to the Russia probe. Watch.
It would be unthinkable if the president actually did what was reported, asked FBI Director Comey to, in effect, back off of at least the investigation into General Flynn.
Meantime, White House counselor Kellyanne Conway is not ruling out President Trump invoking executive privilege to block Comey's testimony, saying the president will make the final decision on that. So I'm going to go to you first, Ambassador Bolton. What do you think we can expect from this testimony? I think everyone is looking forward to hearing what he has to say.
One of the most pompous, self-serving presentations by any witness in congressional history. This will be all about the greater glory of Jim Comey. He's got these memoranda of conversations that he wrote apparently after several meetings with the president. Memcons, as they're called in bureaucraties. At the State Department, there used to be a slogan, nobody ever lost the battle of the Memcons. There's Jim Comey resisting some depredation by Donald Trump, standing firm for American liberty against all this pressure. He'll be wonderful. He could write the Hollywood script right there.
Do you think we'll have any clarity, though? I mean, I think that's what everyone wants is, trying to find out if he actually was pressured to lay off the investigation from President Trump. But he's so highly politicized and controversial that even if there is some kind of smoking gun, I don't know if people will necessarily believe him.
Yeah, well, I think pressure is not obstruction of justice alone. And let's be clear, the FBI director works for the president. The Constitution says very explicitly, the executive power shall be vested in the President of the United States. It doesn't say, except when Jim Comey is director of the FBI, and then he has a separate executive power. Even if Trump had done it, it would be permissible to do.
What's it going to come down to, though, with this testimony and the content of these memoranda? Is it going to come down to word parsing? And, did he ask him to lay off? Was it more gentle than that?
Well, we're going to hear Comey's side of it, and it won't be gentle, for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the problem here.
Do you think he wants to bring down the president?
I think he wants to protect the image of James Comey, and that's why you will hear him respond to many questions by saying, well, I really can't address that because that's a matter still under investigation. He'll address what benefits Comey, and he won't address what doesn't.
When you say that, it makes me think, what do you think the future is for him anyway?
I think he'll go to a big law firm, make millions of dollars, great success out on the speaking circuit. He's in very good shape.
No, he's going to end up with his own talk show.
Yes,
I'm serious. He's going to end up with his own show.
Quite the reputation. It wasn't necessarily a positive one. He came from corporate America.
Yeah, look, there's a category of attorneys like this. Many of them become independent counsel, like Bob Mueller, who's now investigating president. It's all about them. You challenge their rectitude, and suddenly they just rise. Aura glows around them. They're glorified by the Washington press corps. It's really something to watch. It's the model of Archie Cox from Watergate.
Wouldn't you think that a man who had that capacity of aura rising and all that you just described, if he really felt like the president were interfering in an investigation, wouldn't he let his aura rise over that?
Well, you've picked a point of particular vulnerability, since he did testify in an open session of Congress after this famous encounter with the president that nobody had tried him to stop pressure and to stop the investigation. So how he answers that, if there were good questioners in this congressional committee, if there were good questioners.
Let's go.
All right, we got to move on. We'll be right back. More Outnumbered in just a minute.